History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3, The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 6, The Roman Achievement. Already, Hellenistic civilization had achieved a remarkable mixing of the East and the West. Now, Rome continued the process over an even wider area. The element in the new cosmopolitanism which was most obvious was indeed the Greek, for the Romans themselves made much of their inheritance from the Greeks, though it was the Greeks of the Hellenistic era with whom they were most at home. All educated Romans were bilingual, and this illustrates the tradition upon which they drew. Latin was the official language and always remained the language of the army. It was spoken widely in the West, and to judge by the military records, literacy in it was high. Greek was the lingua franca in the eastern provinces, understood by all officials and merchants, and used in the courts if the litigants wished. Educated Romans grew up to read the Greek classics and drew from them their standards. The creation of a literature which could stand on an equal footing with the older was the laudable ambition of most Roman writers. In the first century AD, they got nearest to this, and the coincidence of a cultural and an imperial achievement is striking in Virgil, the conscious renewer of the epic tradition, who was also the poet of imperial mission. It may be that in this lies one clue to the peculiar tenor of Roman culture. Perhaps it is the obviousness and the pervasiveness of the Greek background, which does much to deprive it of the air of novelty. Its weight was accentuated by the Roman static conservative concern of Roman thinkers. Between them, their attention was absorbed almost exclusively by the two foci provided by the Greek inheritance and the moral and political traditions of the Republic. Both lived on curiously and somewhat artificially in a material setting, which more and more ceased to fit them. Formal education changed little in practice, and the content from century to century, for example, Livy, the great Roman historian, sought again to quicken republican virtues in his history, but not to criticize and reinterpret them. Even when Roman civilization was irreversibly urban, the almost extinct virtues of the independent peasant continued to be celebrated, and rich Romans longed, they said, to get away from it all to the simple life of the countryside. Roman sculpture only provided again what Greeks had already done better. The philosophies of Rome were Greek too. Epicureanism and Stoicism held the center of the stage. Neoplatonism was innovatory but came from the East, as did the mystery religions, which were eventually to provide Roman men and women with something their culture could not give them. Only in two practical fields were the Romans to be great innovators: law and engineering. The achievements of the lawyers were relatively late. It was in the second and early third centuries AD that the jurisconsults began the accumulation of commentary which would be so valuable a legacy to the future when codification passed their work to medieval Europe. In engineering, and Romans did not distinguish it from architecture. The quality of their achievement is more immediately impressive. It was a source of pride to the Romans and one of the few things in which they were sure they outstripped the Greeks. It was based on cheap labor. In Rome, it was slaves, and in the provinces, often the unemployed legions on garrison duty in peaceful times, who carried out the great works of hydraulic engineering, bridging, and road building. But more was involved than material factors. The Romans virtually founded town planning as an art and administrative skill west of the Indus, and their inventions of concrete and the vaulted dome revolutionized the shapes of buildings. For the first time, the interiors of the buildings became more than a series of surfaces for decoration. Volumes and lighting became part of the subject matter of architecture. The later Christian basilicas were to be the first great expressions of a new concern with the spaces inside the buildings. Roman technical accomplishment was stamped on an area stretching from the Black Sea in the east to the Hadrian's Wall in the north and the Atlas Mountains in the south. The capital, of course, contained some of its most spectacular relics. There, the wealth of the empire expressed itself in a richness of finish and decoration nowhere else so concentrated. When the marble facings were intact and paint and stucco molding relieved the sheer mass of stone, Rome must have had some of the appeal to the imagination earlier possessed by Babylon. There was an ostentation about it, which spoke of a certain vulgarity too. But in this again, it is not hard to sense a difference of quality between Rome and Greece. Roman civilization has a grossness and materiality inescapable in even its greatest monuments. In part, this was the simple expression of the social realities on which the empire rested. Rome, like all the ancient world, was built on a sharp division of rich and poor, and in the capital itself, this division was an abyss not concealed but consciously expressed. The contrasts of wealth were flagrant in the difference between the sumptuousness of the houses of the new rich, drawing to themselves the profits of the empire and calling on the services of perhaps scores of slaves on the spot and hundreds on the estates which maintained them, and the swarming tenements in which the Roman proletariats lived. Romans found no difficulty in accepting such divisions as part of the natural order. For that matter, few civilizations have ever much worried about them before our own, though few displayed them so flagrantly as imperial Rome. Unfortunately, though easy to recognize, the realities of wealth in Rome still remain curiously opaque to the historian. The finances of only one senator, the younger Pliny, are known to us in any detail. The Roman pattern was reflected in all the great cities of the empire. It was central to the civilization that Rome sustained everywhere. The provincial cities stood like islands of Greco Roman culture in the aboriginal countrysides of the subject peoples. Due allowance made for climate, they reflected a pattern of life of remarkable uniformity, displaying Roman priorities. Each had a forum, temples, theaters, baths, whether added to old cities or built as part of the basic plan of which were refounded. Regular grid patterns were adopted as ground plans. The government of the cities was in the hands of local bigwigs, the curiales or city fathers who, at least until Trajan's time, enjoyed a very large measure of independence in the conduct of municipal affairs, though later a tighter supervision was to be imposed on them. Some of these cities, such as Alexandria or Antioch or Carthage, which the Romans refounded, grew to a very large size. The greatest of all the cities was Rome itself, eventually containing more than 1 million people. In this civilization, the omnipresence of the amphitheater is a standing reminder of the brutality and coarseness of which it was capable. It is important not to get this out of perspective, just as it is important not to infer too much about decadence from the much quoted works of would be moral reformers. One disadvantage under which the repute of Roman civilization has labored is that it is one of the few before the modern times in which we have very much insight into the popular mind through its entertainments for the gladiatorial games and the wild beast shows were emphatically mass entertainment in a way in which the Greek theatre was not. Popular relaxation is, in any era, hardly likely to be found edifying by the sensitive, and the Romans institutionalized its least attractive aspects by building great centers for their shows and by permitting the mass entertainment industry to be used as a political device. The provision of spectacular games was one of the ways in which a rich man could bring to bear his wealth to secure political advancement. Nevertheless, when all allowances are made for the fact that we cannot know how, say, the ancient masses of Egypt or Assyria amused themselves, we are left with the uniqueness of the gladiatorial spectacle. It was an exploitation of cruelty as entertainment on a bigger scale than ever before, and one unrivaled until the 20th century. It was made possible by the urbanization of Roman culture, which could deliver larger mass audiences than ever. The ultimate roots of the games were Etruscan, but their development sprang from a new scale of urbanism and the exigencies of Roman politics. Another aspect of the brutality at the heart of Roman society was, of course, far from unique, the omnipresence of slavery. As in Greek society, slavery was so varied in its forms that it cannot be summarized in a generalization. Many slaves earned wages, some bought their freedom, and the Roman slave had rights at law. The growth of the large plantation estates, it is true, provided examples of a new intensification of it in the first century or so, but it would be hard to say Roman slavery was worse than that of other ancient societies. A few who questioned the institution were very untypical. Moralists reconciled themselves to slave owning as easily as later Christians were to do. Much of what we know about popular mentality before modern times is known through religion. Roman religion was a very obvious part of Roman life, but that may be misleading if we think in modern terms. It had nothing to do with the individual salvation and not much with the individual behavior. It was above all a public matter. It was a part of the Republica, a series of rituals whose maintenance was good for the state, whose neglect would bring retribution. There was no priestly caste set apart from other men. If we exclude one or two antiquarian survivals in the temples of a few special cults. And priestly duties were the task of the magistrates who found priesthood a useful social and political lever. Nor was there creed or dogma. What was required of Romans was only that the ordained services and rituals should be carried out in the accustomed way. For the proletarian, this meant little except that he should not work on a holiday. The civic authorities were everywhere responsible for the rites, but they were responsible for the maintenance of the temples. The proper observances had a powerfully practical purpose. Livy reports a council saying the gods look kindly on scrupulous observance of religious rites which has brought our country to its peak. Men genuinely felt that the peace of Augustus was the pax diorum, a divine reward for a proper respect for the gods which Augustus had reasserted. Somewhat more cynically, Cicero had remarked that the gods were needed to prevent chaos in society. This, if different, was also an expression of the Romans' practical approach to religion. It was not insincere or disbelieving. The recourse to diviners for the interpretation of omens and the acceptance of the decisions of the augurs about important acts of policy would alone establish that. But it was unmysterious and down to earth in its understanding of the official cults. The content of these was a mixture of Greek mythology and festivals, and rites derived from primitive Roman practice and therefore heavily marked by agricultural preoccupations. One which lived to deck itself out in the symbols of another religion was the December Saturnalia, which is with us still as Christmas. But the religion practiced by Romans stretched far beyond official rites. The most striking feature of the Roman approach to religion was its eclecticism and cosmopolitanism. There was room in the empire for all manner of belief, provided it did not contravene public order or inhibit adherence to the official observances. For the most part, peasants everywhere pursued the timeless superstitions of their local nature cults. Townsmen took up new crazes from time to time, and the educated professed some acceptance of the classical pantheon of Greek gods and led the people in the official observances. Each clan and household finally sacrificed it to its own god with appropriate special rituals at the great moments of human life: childbirth, marriage, sickness, and death. Each household had its own shrine, each street corner its idol. Under Augustus, there was deliberate attempt to reinvigorate old belief, which had been somewhat eroded by closer acquaintance with the Hellenistic East and about which a few skeptics had shown cynicism even in the 2nd century BC. After Augustus, emperors always held the office of the chief priest, Pontifex Maximus, and political and religious primacy were thus combined in the same person. This began the increasing importance and definition of the imperial cult itself. It fitted well with the Romans' innate conservatism, his respect for the ways and customs of his ancestors. The imperial cult linked respect for the traditional patrons, the placating or invoking of familiar deities, and the commemoration of great men and events to the ideas of divine kingship which came from the East, from Asia. It was there that altars were first raised to Rome or to the Senate, and there that they were soon reattributed to the emperor. The cult spread through the whole empire, though it was not until the 3rd century AD that the practice was wholly respectable at Rome itself. So strong was republican sentiment. But even there, the strains of empire had already favored a revival of official piety, which benefited the imperial cult. This was not all that came from the East. By the 2nd century, the distinction of a pure Roman religious tradition from others within the empire is virtually impossible. The Roman pantheon, like the Greek, was absorbed almost indistinguishably into a mass of beliefs and cults, their boundaries blurred and fluid, merging imperceptibly over a scale of experience running from sheer magic to the philosophical monotheism popularized by the Stoic philosophies. The intellectual and religious world of the empire was omnivorous, credulous, and deeply irrational. It is important here not to be overimpressed by the visible practicality of the Roman mind. Practical men are often superstitious, nor was the Greek heritage understood in an altogether rational way. And its philosophers were seen by the 1st century BC as men, inspired, holy men, whose mystical teachings was the most eagerly studied part of their works, and even Greek civilization had always rested on a broad basis of popular superstition and local cult practice. Tribal gods swarmed throughout the Roman world. All this boils down to a large measure of practical criticism of the ancient Roman ways. Obviously, they were no longer enough for an urban civilization, however numerically preponderant the peasants on which it rested. Many of the traditional festivals were pastoral or agricultural in origin, but occasionally even the god they invoked was forgotten. City dwellers gradually came to need more than piety in a more and more puzzling world. Men grasped desperately at anything which could give meaning to the world and some degree of control over it. Old superstitions and new crazes benefited. The evidence can be seen in the appeal of the Egyptian gods, whose cults flooded through the empire as its security made travel and intercourse easier. They were even patronized by an emperor, the Libyan Septimius Severus. A civilized world of greater complexity and unity than any earlier was also one of the greater and greater religiosity and a curiousness almost boundless. One of the last great teachers of pagan antiquity, Apollonius of Tyana, was said to have lived and studied with the Brahmins of India. Men were looking about for new saviors long before one was found in the 1st century AD. Another symptom of Eastern influence was the popularization of mysteries cults, which rested upon the communication of special virtues and powers to the initiated by secret rites. The sacrificial cults of the Mithras, a minor Zoroastrian deity, especially favored by soldiers, was one of the most famous. Almost all the mysteries register impatience with the constraints of the material world, an ultimate pessimism about it, and a preoccupation with, and perhaps a promise of survival after death. In this lay their power to provide a psychological satisfaction no longer offered by the old gods and never really possessed by the official cult. They drew individuals to them. They had some of the appeal that was later to draw men to Christianity, which in its earliest days was often seen significantly as another mystery. The Roman rule did not satisfy all Roman subjects all the time was even true in Italy itself when, as late as 73 BC, in the disorderly last age of the Republic, a great slave revolt required 3 years of military campaigning and was punished with the crucifixion of 6,000 slaves along the roads from Rome to the south. In the provinces, revolt was endemic, always likely to be provoked by a particular burst of harsh or bad government. Such was the famous rebellion of Boadicea in Britain, or the earlier Pannonian Revolt under Augustus. Sometimes such troubles could look back to the local traditions of independence, as was the case at Alexandria, where they were frequent. In one particular instant, that of the Jews, they touched chords not unlike those of later nationalism. The spectacular Jewish record of disobedience and resistance goes back beyond Roman rule to 170 BC, when they bitterly resisted the westernizing practices of the Hellenistic kingdoms, which first adumbrated policies later to be taken up by Rome. The imperial cult made matters worse. Even Jews who did not mind Roman tax gatherers and thought that Caesar should have rendered unto him what was Caesar's were bound to draw the line at the blasphemy of sacrifice at his altar. In 66 AD came a great revolt. There were others under Trajan and Hadrian. Jewish communities were like powder kegs. Their sensitivity makes somewhat more understandable the unwillingness of the procurator of Judea in about 30 AD to press hard for the strict observance of the legal rights of an accused man when Jewish leaders demanded his death. Taxes kept the empire going, although not heavy in normal times, when they paid for administration and police quite comfortably. They were a hated burden and one augmented too from time to time by levies in kind, requisitioning, and forced recruiting. For a long time, they drew on a prosperous and growing economy. This was not only a matter of such lucky imperial acquisitions as the gold mines of Dacia. The growth in the circulation of trade and the stimulus provided by the new markets of the great frontier encampments also favored the appearance of new industry and suppliers. The huge numbers of wine jars found by archaeologists are only an indicator of what must have been a vast commerce of foodstuffs, textiles, spices, which have left fewer traces. Yet the economic base of the empire was always agriculture. This was not rich by modern standards, for its techniques were primitive. No Roman farmer ever saw a windmill and watermills were still rare when the empire ended in the West. For all its idealization, rural life was a harsh and laborious thing. To it too, therefore, the Pax Romana was essential. It meant that taxes could be found from the small surplus produced and that lands would not be ravaged. In the last resort, almost everything seems to come back to the army on which the Roman peace depended. Yet it was an instrument which changed over 6 centuries as much as did the Roman state itself. Roman society and culture were always militaristic, yet the instruments of militarianism changed. From the time of Augustus, the army was a regular, long service force, no longer relying, even formally, upon the obligation of all citizens to serve. The ordinary legionary served for 20 years, 4 in reserve, and increasingly came from the provinces as time went by. Surprisingly, as it may seem, given the repute of Roman discipline, volunteers seem to have been plentiful enough for letters of recommendation and the use of patents to be resorted to by would be recruits. The 28 legions, which were the normal establishment after the defeat in Germany, were distributed along the frontiers, about 160,000 men in all. They were the core of the army, which contained about as many men again in the cavalry, auxiliaries, and other arms. The legions continued to be commanded by senators, except in Egypt, and the central issue of the politics as the capital itself was still access to opportunities such as this. For as had become clearer and clearer as the centuries passed, it was in the camps of the legions that the heart of the empire lay. Though the Praetorian Guard at Rome sometimes contested their right to choose an emperor, yet the soldiers comprised only part of the history of the empire. Quite as much impact was made on it in the long run by the handful of men who were the followers and disciples of the man the procurator of Judea had handed over to execution. Chapter 7, Jewry and the Coming of Christianity. Few readers of this book are likely to have heard of Abgar, far less of his East Syrian kingdom, Osirhon. Yet this little known and obscure monarch was long believed to be the first Christian king. In fact, the story of his conversion is a legend. It seems to have been under his descendant, Abgar the eighth or ninth. So vague is our information that Osihon became Christian at the end of the 2nd century AD. The conversion may not even have included the king himself, but this did not trouble hagiographers. They placed Abgar at the head of a long and great tradition. In the end, it was to incorporate virtually the whole history of monarchy in Europe. From there, it was to spread to influence rulers in other parts of the world. All these monarchs would behave differently because they saw themselves as Christians. Yet, important though it was, this is only a tiny part of the difference Christianity has made to history. Until the coming of industrial society, in fact, it is the only historical phenomenon we have to consider whose implications, creative power, and impact are comparable with the great determinants of prehistory in shaping the world we live in. Christianity grew up within the classical world of Roman Empire, fusing itself in the end with its institutions and spreading through its social and mental structures to become our most important legacy from the civilization. Often disguised or muted Its influence runs through all the great creative processes of the last 1500 years. Almost incidentally, it defined Europe. That continent and others are what they are today because a handful of Jews saw their teacher and leader crucified and believed he rose again from the dead.